I want to be clear about one thing before I tell you any of this. I am not a man who pays attention to politics. I am not a man who reads the sovereignty dispatches that come through the Arath's Reach Station office every third Tuesday. I am not a man who knows the names of dragon bloodlines, or who sits up listening to the overnight radio when the news comes down from the Northern Territories. My name is Cale Bryn. I have worked pen row 12 at the Hareth Livestock Station for 31 years. I shovel feed, I replace water lines, I patch the mesh when the older animals get restless in the spring and push against the fencing. I know which pens flood and which don't. I know the smell of a sick animal from 40 yards in a headwind. I do not know much else, and I have never pretended to. So when they brought the hatchling in, I was not thinking about bloodlines. I was thinking about the feed trough in pen 9, which had developed a crack along the bottom seam, and was losing water into the chalk dust at a rate that was going to cause me significant problems come morning. That was where my head was. The hatchling was not my concern. Except that they put it in pen 12, which was, unfortunately, mine. I should explain how the station works, for anyone who has not spent time on a frontier livestock operation. Hareth ran about 300 head at any given time, mostly dray breed, a few of the smaller domestic strains, and the pen rows ran parallel along the east flank of the main barn, numbered 1 through 14. Row 12 was the quarantine row. Anything that came in sick, anything that came in unregistered, anything that the receiving clerk did not know what to do with, it went in 12, which meant it went to me. I had been the row 12 man for so long that the younger hands called it Bryn's Row without a trace of irony, like it was a formal title. It was not a compliment. Row 12 got the difficult ones, the ones with no paperwork, the ones that arrived at odd hours in unmarked transports, handed over by people who made brief eye contact and then left quickly. Those animals required more attention and produced more paperwork for less money than anything else on the station. And over the years, every other senior hand had found increasingly creative reasons to be assigned elsewhere. I stayed because I had nowhere else in particular to be. The hatchling arrived on a Tuesday in the third month of the dry season, which is the worst time of year to run anything in the quarantine row because the water pressure drops in the late afternoon, and you spend an hour every evening hand-carrying buckets to make up the difference. I was in the middle of exactly that when Tomas, the receiving clerk, came around the corner of the barn with his clipboard and the particular expression he wore when he was about to make my evening longer. "Got a special intake," he said. Special at Hareth meant unregistered, unusual, or otherwise someone else's problem that had been transferred to become my problem. "What is it?" He looked at his clipboard, then at the item in his arms, then back at the clipboard. "Dragon hatchling, day old, maybe less. They're logging it as a standard intake, but..." He lowered his voice in the way that people lower their voices when the room is empty and they want to feel important. It came from the Regional Sovereignty Holding Facility, the one up on Cress Ridge. I knew the Cress Ridge facility. Everyone on Arath's Reach knew it, a large, clean operation about 40 kilometers north, where the Sovereignty ran its regional breeding registry. It handled the official clutches, the registered bloodlines, the animals with pedigree documentation going back generations. It was, in every sense, the exact opposite of row 12 at Hareth Station. "And they sent it here," I said. Tomas nodded. He held out the thing in his arms. It was small. I had seen dragon hatchlings before, occasional intakes, animals from disrupted nests on the frontier margins, and they were generally compact and dense, with the weight and solidity you would expect from something built to eventually grow to the size of a freight transport. This one had the opposite quality. It was light in a way that did not seem right. Its scales were a muted gray-green, not the deep copper or gold or dark slate that I associated with healthy hatchlings, and they sat unevenly, slightly puckered along the ridge of its back like they hadn't quite finished deciding where they wanted to be. One wing was folded properly. The other was angled wrong, not broken, just misaligned, the joint sitting a finger's width lower than it should. Its eyes were open. That surprised me. They were a pale amber, almost gold, and they looked at me with the particular intensity that very small animals sometimes have, where they do not know enough about the world to be afraid of anything specific, so they are simply alert to all of it equally. Non-viable, Tomas said, reading from his clipboard. Crest ridge classification. Hatched undersized, one-wing joint subluxated at emergence. Registry says, he turned the page, unlikely to reach viable weight in the standard window. They've flagged it for natural attrition. Natural attrition was the term the registry used when it did not want to write down what it actually meant, which was that the animal was expected to die, and the expectation was being treated as a plan. I looked at the hatchling. The hatchling looked at me. "Where do you want it?" Tomas asked. I pointed at pen 12. "Right, but," he said, lowering his voice again, "they've logged it as non-viable, so technically we're just providing temporary housing until." "Pen 12, I said, "put some fresh bedding down and fill the water bowl before you go." Tomas filled the water bowl, which told me he was glad to be rid of the paperwork and not interested in having an argument. He put the hatchling down in the far corner of the pen, made a note on his clipboard, and left. The hatchling sat in the corner for a moment. Then it walked to the water bowl, unsteady, listing slightly to the left because of the wing joint, but walking, and drank. I stood there longer than I should have, holding my bucket, watching a non-viable dragon hatchling drink water in my pen. Then I went and got it some feed. The first 2 weeks were not remarkable. This is not me being modest, they genuinely were not. I was busy. March on the dry season is a full station maintenance window when every water line gets inspected and the fencing inventory gets done, and about 40% of the animals in the regular rows require some kind of health check. I had my hands more than full, and I will be honest, I was not devoting careful thought to the hatchling. I was giving it food and water on my regular rounds because it was in my pen, and that was what I did with things in my pen. I did not have a philosophy about it. What I did have was an observation, which I made at the end of the first week without much emotional investment. It was still alive. This should not have been notable. An animal surviving a week is not an event, but the Crest Ridge classification had said unlikely to reach viable weight in the standard window, and the standard window for a hatchling that small by the registry guidelines, which I had looked up in the station manual out of professional curiosity, and nothing more, was approximately 10 days. After 10 days, the registry considered the situation resolved, one way or another. After 10 days, the hatchling was alive and had eaten most of a small pan of ground grain mash and drunk approximately twice what I expected of its size. I noted this. I did not celebrate it. I gave it more mash. The wing joint was a problem I thought about mostly at night, the way you think about practical problems when you are lying in the dark and your mind does not have anything more urgent to occupy it. The joint was subluxated, which meant it was sitting wrong in the socket but not separated from it entirely. And I had seen that kind of misalignment in dray animals occasionally, usually from difficult births, and the outcome depended almost entirely on whether the animal was allowed to compensate. If it started using the bad joint as a load-bearing point, it would seat further wrong as the animal grew and eventually become unfixable. If it was prevented from using it incorrectly while the supporting tissue strengthened, the joint had a decent chance of seating itself properly over time. I am not a veterinary specialist. I want to be clear about that. I have no formal training in anything. What I had was 31 years of watching animals move, and a collection of materials in the maintenance shed that included, among other things, a roll of the dense medical-grade bandaging that the station used to wrap sprains in the larger dray animals. I took an evening and wrapped the bad wing. Not tightly, just enough to prevent the joint from torquing outward when the hatchling moved. The hatchling sat through the process with patience I had not expected, head tilted, watching my hands with those amber eyes like it was studying the procedure rather than tolerating it. I showed it to Dara, our station medic, when she came through on her weekly round. She looked at the wrapping, she looked at the hatchling, she looked at the wrapping again. "Is this from the dray roll?" she said. "Yes." "Did you read about the proper wrapping technique for a subluxated wing joint in a juvenile dragon?" "No, I use judgment." Dara was quiet for a moment. "The technique looks correct," she said. She sounded the way people sound when they want to be annoyed at you but cannot find the specific technical error that would justify it. "But it's logged as non-viable. If it dies, the station is not liable for veterinary interventions." "I haven't billed anyone," I said. "The bandage came out of maintenance supplies." She looked at the hatchling again. It was eating from the pan I had set near the door of the pen, moving with its characteristic slight list, the wrapped wing held at a tidier angle than before. "You know what Cress Ridge sent it here for," she said. It was not a question. "I know what they wrote on the form," I said. She was quiet again for longer this time. "I'll come back next week," she said, "and I won't put it in my log that I was here." I thanked her. She left. The hatchling finished its pan and looked at me with those pale amber eyes. "Don't look at me like that," I told it. "I'm just doing my rounds." By the 6th week it had a name, which was my fault and happened by accident. I had started talking to it during my evening rounds, which I also did with the older animals. Not conversation, exactly, more the kind of running commentary that helps you stay awake during repetitive work. I told it about the crack in Pen 9's trough, still not fixed, Tomas having decided it was a structural issue requiring a specialist. I told it about the argument I'd had with the feed supplier about the grain-to-fiber ratio in the new mash blend. I told it about the weather, which is not a very interesting topic on Arath's Reach in the dry season, because the answer is always the same answer, but I had run out of other things to report. On the evening of the 43rd day, it did something I had not seen it do before. It answered. Not words. A sound, a low, resonant hum that came from somewhere in its chest, the kind of sound that you felt more than heard, like someone had struck the low string on a very large instrument somewhere inside the wall. I stopped talking. It hummed again, with what seemed to me like polite expectation, the way you hum when someone has paused in a story and you would like them to continue. "Rennie," I said. I do not know why I said it. It was not a name I had planned. It was just what came out. It hummed a third time. That was his name from then on. Rennie. I am aware this is not a draconic name. I am aware that nomming a non-viable intake animal is an emotional liability and a breach of professional distance. I told myself both of these things and they made no difference, because by week 6 Rennie had opinions, small, expressed through sound opinions, but opinions, about the timing of his meals, the temperature of his water, and whether or not I was giving him enough attention during the morning round. And if you have ever tried to maintain professional distance towards something that has opinions about whether you are paying it enough attention, you will understand that it is not always possible. I will tell you what a typical morning looked like in those early months, because I do not want you to imagine it as something larger than it was. I came in at first light. I checked the water line pressure in the main barn, noted whatever had changed overnight in the regular rows, and then worked my way down row 12 from pen 1 to pen 14, which is to say I ended with him. By the time I reached pen 12, the light was coming up properly through the barn's east-facing vents, the particular yellow-white light of a dry season morning on Arath's Reach, and Rennie would be standing at the mesh door already. Not with urgency, just with presence, the way a person stands at a window watching for someone they expect. I would fill his water first, then his pan. While he ate, I ran my hands along the wrapped wing, checking the tension, checking the joint. In the early weeks this had to be done carefully because the joint was genuinely tender and he would hold very still with concentration during the process. By month 2, he had learned to hold the wing at exactly the angle that gave me the clearest access to the joint, and would keep it there without moving until I was done, after which he would fold it back and return to his pan as though we had completed a routine transaction, which I suppose we had. In the evenings, I would stay a few minutes longer than I needed to. This was the part I did not report to anyone, including myself, for quite some time. The pen grew quieter in the evenings as the other animals settled, and the light came in differently, more horizontal, catching the dust that moved through old wood, and Rennie would position himself near the door, and I would lean against the post outside, and we would each attend to the end of the day without making a particular point of it. His wing was improving. This was the objective measure I fell back on when I wanted to feel like I was thinking about this professionally. The joint had been seating back towards center gradually over the weeks, and Dara, who kept coming by and kept not putting it in her log, had said in the 8th week that if the progress continued at this rate, the joint would be functionally stable within the year. Not perfect. The wing would always carry a slight cant, but functional, she said. Able to bear the animal's weight when fully grown, able to do what wings were supposed to do. This was, by the standards of a case that had been classified as natural attrition, an absurd outcome. I did not share it with anyone beyond Dara, because I did not particularly want to explain the last 2 months to Tomas or anyone else on the station roster. What I also did not share, and what I was only beginning to understand myself, was the other thing, the quality that had nothing to do with his wing. The thing was this: Rennie was smart in a way that was not ordinary. I had worked with animals for 31 years, and I knew the range of what animal intelligence looked like at different ages and developmental stages. I knew what a hatchling at 8 weeks could typically do. Rennie at 8 weeks was doing things that I associated with much older animals. He had mapped the entire pen complex, not just his pen, the whole of row 12, as far as he could observe it through his mesh door, and he tracked the movements of every other animal in the row with a precision that made me feel watched in a way that I did not fully understand. He distinguished between the regular station hands by sound before he could see them, and his behavior changed depending on who was coming, relaxed for me, neutral for Dara, withdrawn to the back corner for Tomas, who had never done anything wrong but apparently gave off some quality that Rennie found suspicious. He also watched the sky in a way I could only describe as purposeful. There was a roof panel in the far end of the quarantine row that had been slightly ajar since a wind event 3 years prior, and it let in a strip of sky about 30 centimeters wide. Every afternoon, when the light came through at the right angle, Rennie would position himself under it and look up for an extended period. Not the way animals look at unfamiliar things, not with alarm or confusion. With something closer to calculation. One afternoon in the 4th month, I sat outside the pen door while he did it and just watched. He stood with his head tilted at approximately 30 degrees, the pale amber eyes tracking something I could not see. His nostrils moved in a pattern that was not quite breathing, more like he was reading the air in discrete intervals. Every few minutes he made that low pulse sound. The one I had noticed was different from his hum, shorter, more focused, a concentrated emission rather than an ambient one. I timed the intervals between pulses. They were consistent, exactly consistent, the same gap each time for 40 minutes, until the light shifted and he stopped and looked at me instead. And I felt, not for the first time, that he had known I was watching the whole time and had simply decided I did not require acknowledgement. I mentioned this to Dara in the 9th week, trying to keep my voice in the register of professional observation, rather than the register of a man who was fairly sure his hatchling was thinking hard about things. "How long does he look?" she asked. 30 minutes sometimes, an hour on clear days. She was quiet. "Has he made any sounds during it?" "Yes," I said. "Not the humming, something lower, more like a pulse." She looked at me. "You know there are specific draconic calls associated with certain bloodline recognition behaviors, navigation calls, some of them, used at distance." I don't know anything about bloodlines, I said, which was true. No, she said, I know you don't. She looked at Rennie, who was at the far end of his pen doing something with his claws that appeared to be systematic sorting of the pebbles in his water drainage channel into groups I could not determine the organizing principle of. I'm going to make a call, she said, to a colleague, about some of this. Is that all right? I don't own him, I said. He's a station intake. No, she said, the same even tone. He's not quite. He's a non-viable classification from Cress Ridge, which means officially he doesn't, she stopped. I'll make the call, you just keep doing what you're doing. I kept doing what I was doing. The months passed the way months pass at a frontier livestock station, which is to say one day at a time and with considerable sameness. Feed, water, fence check, trough maintenance, morning rounds, evening rounds, paperwork for intake, paperwork for discharge, the occasional excitement of a sick animal or a broken water main, and then the next day the same again. I had been living this cycle for so long that I had stopped being able to imagine a different kind of day. The way you stop being able to imagine certain colors when you haven't seen them in a long time. Rennie did not make my days sameness. That is not the right word for it. He did not make them dramatic, either, or unusual in any way I could have described to someone on the outside. He just made them more present, like there was something in Pen 12 that was paying attention to the texture of each day, and that attention was catching. I should say something about what the other hands thought of all this, because I am aware that the picture I have painted so far is one of a barn hand operating in isolation, and that is not quite right. Hareth was a working station with 8 full-time hands and 4 seasonal ones, and they all walked through row 12 at some point in any given week, and they all knew about Rennie by the end of the first month. The general opinion in the first month was that I was wasting time on a write-off. This was expressed in different registers depending on the person, gently from the 2 hands who had worked at Hareth nearly as long as I had, directly from the 3 younger ones who had not yet learned to be indirect with me, and diplomatically from Tomas, who had registered opinions about everything and expressed them as paperwork concerns. The argument, such as it was, went like this. The station had a limited feed budget. Row 12 was already the most resource-intensive row, and a non-viable classification from the Cress Ridge registry was not something you argued with because Cress Ridge had been doing this longer than Hareth had been a station. I listened to the argument. I agreed with parts of it. I kept feeding Rennie. By the 3rd month the opinion had shifted, in the way opinions on a working station shift, not through argument but through accumulation of evidence. Rennie was visibly growing. The wing was visibly improving. He was, by any observable measure, not dying, and it is difficult to maintain a strong opinion about a non-viable classification when the non-viable animal in question is eating everything put in front of it and sorting pebbles with evident purpose. The argument became quieter. The younger hands began making detours past Pen 12 on their way to other rows, which I noticed and did not comment on. In the 5th month he began doing something new. He started leaving me things. This is how I described it at the time, and I understood that it was not the precise description, but I did not have a better one. In the mornings when I came in, I would find small objects positioned near the door of his pen, a particularly smooth pebble from the drainage channel, a piece of shed scale in the gray-green of his early coloring, a fragment of the dried grass from his bedding that had been folded, several times, into a compact shape I was not sure was accidental. They were always different. They were always near the door where I would see them. I picked them up. I put them on the shelf in the feed room. I did not make anything of this, at least not out loud. By the end of the 5th month, the shelf had 17 items on it. Tomas walked past it one morning and stopped and looked at it and said, "Bryn, what is all that?" "Intake items," I said, "from row 12. He looked at them. He looked at me. He went back to his desk. The way Tomas generally went back to his desk when he had calculated that an answer was going to require more energy than he wanted to spend before his first meal of the day. I am not a man who attributes intention to animals. I want to be clear about that. I'm a practical man who has observed animals all his working life, and what I had learned from that observation was that animals do things for reasons that serve them, and the fact that a thing serves them does not mean it was intended for you. But I will say this. On the mornings when I picked up the objects and put them on the shelf, Rennie would watch the process with the quality I had come to associate with him being satisfied. And on the mornings, the 1 or 2 times in those months, when I was running late or distracted and did not pick them up immediately, he was less settled through the rest of the morning round. Whether that means anything, I leave it to others to decide. I only recorded what I observed. He was 5 months old when the wing came free of the wrapping for the first time. I took the bandage off on a Tuesday morning slowly, checking the joint as I went, and when the wing came clear, he spread it in one careful motion, both wings together, to the full extension his pen would allow and a bit more, the tips pressing against the mesh on both sides. He held it for a count of 7. Then he folded them back and hummed. The joint was good. Not perfect, the slight cant was still there, the left wing sitting a finger's width lower at full extension, but good. Dara, who had come by for the occasion with a professional casualness I had long since stopped pretending was accidental, confirmed it with her instruments and then stood quietly for a moment before she spoke. "You know this isn't supposed to have happened," she said. "I know what the form said," I told her. "I mean technically, with the joint, the prognosis at intake." "People write the wrong prognosis sometimes," I said. "They don't have enough information." She looked at him for a long time. "My colleague," she said, "the one I called, she wanted to know if she could come out and do an assessment, a routine one for her own research." I said that was fine with me. It was a station intake and not my decision, which was technically true. The colleague arrived 3 weeks later on a Thursday in a vehicle that was cleaner than anything that usually came to Hareth Station. She was a younger woman, thorough and quiet, and she spent 3 hours in Pen 12 with Rennie while I did my regular rounds. She did not tell me anything she found. She thanked me, made notes in a case file I could not see the front page of, and left in the clean vehicle. I noticed as she drove out that she sat very still in the passenger seat and wrote something in her case file without looking up. People who have received important information write like that. I noted it. I went back to my rounds. That was the end of October. In the first week of November, 2 things happened. The first was that Rennie began to do something new with the sky observation. I had come in for the evening round to find him not standing under the open panel as usual, but instead sitting on the low shelf near the mesh door, a position he had never taken before, with his head tilted at an angle I had to think about for several seconds before I understood it. He was triangulating, using the open panel and the main barn roof line, and something else I could not identify to establish a position relative to something outside, above, or both. The pulse sounds he made during these sessions had changed in the last weeks, shorter, more frequent and directed. He was pointing them somewhere specific. I had the distinct impression, standing outside his pen and watching him work, that he had narrowed something down from a wide search to a precise bearing. The second thing that happened was that I found, clipped to my pen roster on the morning of the 6th, an intake review notice. The formal kind, on green paper with the Sovereignty Registry seal at the top. It said that the Cress Ridge non-viable classification of intake animal H-1203 1 had been flagged for administrative review due to the submission of new veterinary documentation, and that a Sovereignty Review officer would be conducting a site visit within 30 days to reassess the intake status. I showed it to Tomas. He read it twice. He looked at me. "Bryn," he said, "what exactly have you been doing in row 12? "My job," I said. He wanted to say something else and decided against it. He went back to his desk. I went back to my rounds. The clean vehicle came back the following Tuesday. A different passenger this time, not the young colleague, but an older woman, calm and unhurried, with the bearing of someone who had made a long number of decisions and was no longer surprised by them. She was accompanied by a man who carried a case and did not speak. They went to Pen 12. I went with them, because Pen 12 was mine and I went everywhere in Pen 12. Rennie watched them come. He had positioned himself in the center of the pen, which was unusual. He generally moved to one side or the other when strangers entered, giving them his peripheral attention rather than his full front-facing regard. But he stood in the center and watched them with those pale amber eyes, and there was something in his stillness that made even the man with the case stop moving for a moment. The older woman crouched down to his level. She did not reach for him. She waited. He walked to her, not all the way halfway, and then stopped and looked at her with that quality I had spent months trying to find a word for. The quality of assessment, I had decided. Not the reactive assessment of an animal encountering something new, but a considered assessment, the kind that factors in previous information. She spoke to him, not words I understood, a sequence of sounds in a register I had never heard from a person before, lower than conversation, carrying that pulse quality that Rennie made when he observed the sky. He tilted his head. He answered. The same register, a shorter sequence. The man with the case had opened it. He brought out an instrument I did not recognize, small, flat, with a reading panel, and held it near Rennie without touching him. The reading panel filled with something in a color I associated with significance, because the man's expression changed when he saw it. He looked at the older woman. She was still crouched in the same position, looking at Rennie. "Confirmed," the man said. It was the only word he spoke the entire visit. The older woman stood. She turned and looked at me with the direct attention of someone who is seeing a person clearly for the first time after looking at them from a distance for a long time. "How long has he been in your care?" she asked. 7 months, I said. He came in March. "And the wing assessment, you did that yourself?" "With a Dre bandage roll. I'm not a specialist." She looked at Rennie, then back at me. "The joint outcome is within 3% of a full veterinary intervention result," she said, "with a Dre bandage roll." "I had time in the evenings," I said, "and the technique isn't complicated if you read the anatomy right." She was quiet for a moment. "He's been calling," she said. "The sky observation your medic described. He's been using a recognition call, a specific navigational call used by this particular bloodline for approximately 2 months. We've had receivers in the northern tier picking it up but couldn't triangulate to a point this far south." She paused. "The Crest Ridge facility recorded his clutch as non-viable on emergence day and cleared it for natural attrition. The full clutch, 4 eggs. He was the only one placed in an external facility. The other 3 were retained." I waited. "The clutch registry number," she said, "matches the first clutch record of the Varath-Solon founding line. The unregistered first clutch, the clutch from the founding pair's 4th cycle, which was never formally recorded because the emergence happened during the Crest Ridge administrative transfer 3 years ago, and the intake clerk at the time entered the hatching date under the wrong bloodline code." She said this in the measured tone of someone delivering information they have checked many times and no longer have feelings about. "There is no legal ambiguity in the record. There is only a filing error, and the filing error sent this animal here rather than to the registry holding suite, where the Varath-Solon line would have been notified immediately." I looked at Rennie. He was sitting now, watching the conversation with the calm focus I had come to associate with him filing things away. "What bloodline," I said, "is Varath-Solon?" She turned to look at me again. The particular quality of her attention had changed, the way the light quality changes when the angle shifts even slightly. "The founding bloodline of the Veth sovereignty," she said. "Varath-Solon produced the line's first recognized clutch 400 years ago. The 4th cycle clutch from a founding pair, is, in the sovereignty's registry law, the equivalent of a second founding event. It is the beginning of a new recognized primary line. She paused. This animal's registry papers, once correctly filed, will place him as the first of a new sovereignty primary line. He is not a non-viable intake from a standard breeding rotation. No, I said. He is also not, she continued, with the faintest quality of precision in her voice that I would later understand was how she managed very large emotions. The kind of animal that is typically kept in a frontier quarantine row for 7 months and named by the barn hand. I didn't plan to name him, I said. No, she said, I don't think you did. Rennie hummed. The chest resonance hum, the one I felt more than heard. He was looking at me. What happens now? I asked to him. She looked at the animal in my pen. This small, gray-green, pale amber-eyed, very intelligent 7-month-old dragon who had sorted the pebbles in his drainage channel by weight and watched the sky for 2 months to call something home, and who had a wing with a slight cant from a joint that I had wrapped with a Dre bandage roll on my own judgment on an ordinary March evening. She looked at him for a long time. He'll be transferred to the Sovereignty Holding Suite, she said, where the proper registry documentation will be filed and the new primary line will be formally established. She paused, and the founding pair will be notified that their 4th cycle clutch produced a surviving first. They've believed for 7 months that the clutch was lost. I thought about that. 400 years of a bloodline. A founding pair who had believed since March that their 4th cycle clutch, whatever that meant to a dragon who had been building a line for 4 centuries, was gone. When did they find out he was here? I asked. This morning, she said, when the triangulation data confirmed his position. I thought about what the last few hours had been like for them, whoever they were, wherever they were, high and north, I imagined, somewhere beyond the range of my daily concerns. I thought about finding out in the morning that what you had believed lost was in a frontier livestock station's quarantine row alive, with a wrapped wing, and a name a barn hand had accidentally given it. I would like to be alone with him for a few minutes, I said, before you take him. She looked at me. Then she looked at Rennie again. Then she said yes, and she and the man with the case went away by the clean vehicle. I went into the pen and sat down on the bedding, which is not something I normally did, but the ground seemed like the right level for the conversation. Rennie walked over and sat next to me in the way he had been doing since about the 3rd month, close enough that his flank was against my leg. I did not know what to say to him. I had spent 7 months talking to him about trough cracks and feed ratios and the weather, and now I was sitting in his pen for what might be the last time, and I could not think of a single useful thing. You knew, I said, didn't you, the calling, the sky watching? He hummed the long, low one. You weren't confused, I said. You knew exactly where you were. You were just, I stopped. You were just waiting for them to figure it out while you were here. He put his head against my arm, not leaning heavily, just resting it there, the way he had started doing in the 4th month when I sat with him during the afternoon quiet. It was not a gesture I had taught him. It was just what he did. I thought about the shelf in the feed room, the 17 items. I thought about him standing at his mesh door in the mornings before I arrived, and whether he had been standing there because he expected me or because he had been tracking the approach. I thought about the pebbles sorted into groupings I had never understood, and whether the groupings were the same groupings each time or whether they changed, and how it had not occurred to me until this moment to check. I had the thought, sitting there, that what Rennie had been doing for 7 months in Pen 12 was not simply surviving. It was something more deliberate. He had been waiting, and while he waited, he had been paying close attention to everything in his world, and everything in his world had been primarily me. I did not know what to do with that thought, so I filed it next to the other things I had not known what to do with. They'll take good care of you, I said, which was obvious and unnecessary and the right thing to say anyway. Better than a Dre bandage roll, I expect. He made no sound. The late afternoon light came through the gap in the roof panel the way it always did, that strip of blue-white frontier sky, and I watched it fall across him the way I had watched it 100 times, and I thought, for 7 months I have done my rounds in the morning and my rounds in the evening, and given this animal water and food, and a wrapped wing and bad conversation about trough maintenance. That is all I have done. That is the complete inventory of what I brought to this situation. And then I thought it was enough. It was exactly enough. He is alive. I stood up. He stood with me and walked with me to the pen door as he always did when I finished my rounds, and stood at the mesh and watched me go. The woman, her name was Veth Moron, which I learned later, and which meant something in the sovereignty's formal nomming structure that I did not understand, came back to where I was standing outside the pen. "Is there anything you need from us," she said, "before we proceed?" "No," I said. "His feed schedule is on the board, the grain ratio is written down. The wing," I stopped. "The wing doesn't need anything more, it's done what it's going to do." She wrote something in her case file, then she looked up. "I want to explain something to you," she said, "in plain terms. The Varath-Solon line is the founding bloodline of the Veth sovereignty. The founding pair have lived for 4 centuries. They have produced 3 prior clutches, all registered, all significant. The 4th clutch, his clutch, is not a continuation of the existing line. Under sovereignty registry law, it is a new primary line. The founding pair produce 1 new primary line in their full lifespan. This is it." She paused. "The sovereignty does not have a formal term for what this animal will be in 400 years, because we have never had a situation in which the single individual establishing a new primary line was raised in a frontier quarantine row by someone who did not know what they had." "I knew what I had," I said. "I had an animal in my pen." She looked at me, the direct, clear attention. "Yes," she said, "that is what I mean." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "The founding pair will want to meet you, when they are ready and when you are willing, not now, not soon, but at some point. That is not a request, it is a notice of intent." "I'll be here," I said. "I've been here for 31 years." "Yes," she said, "I know." She went back to the pen and spoke to the man with the case. They prepared the transfer housing, a good one, I noted, clean and well ventilated, a different category entirely from the unmarked transport he had arrived in. I watched from outside the mesh as they moved him through the process of being cataloged and documented and prepared for a world that finally knew he existed. Rennie, throughout all of this, was calm. He submitted to the examination, the documentation, the transfer housing with his characteristic careful attention to everything around him. Before they closed the housing, he turned and found me where I was standing by the pen door, not the housing door, the pen door, the place I always stood when I finished my evening round, and he looked at me for a long moment. I did not say anything. There was nothing sensible to say that I hadn't already said. I lifted one hand in the way I had lifted it every evening for 7 months, the gesture that had started as a practical check of the pen's upper mesh seam, and had become somewhere along the way a habit of goodbye that neither of us had formally agreed to but both had understood. He hummed once, the chest resonance, the felt one. The housing closed, the clean vehicle left. I stood in row 12 for a while after. The late light was still coming through the roof panel gap. The pen was empty in the way that pens are empty after a long-term intake, not just physically empty, but specifically empty, empty in the shape of what was there. I noted the water bowl, which would need cleaning. I noted the feed pan, which had a small dent from where he had pushed it against the wall in the first week before he understood that pushing it did not make food appear faster. I noted the pebbles in the drainage channel, sorted into groupings that I had never determined the organizing principle of, and probably now never would. I went and picked up the feed pan. I cleaned the water bowl. I swept the bedding out and put in fresh. I did this not because I had another animal coming in. Row 12 was empty except for a minor case in pen 7 that was nearly resolved, but because it was my pen, and that was what you did with a pen when an animal left it. When it was done, I stood at the door and looked at the clean, empty pen in the fading afternoon light. And I thought about a March evening when I had been worrying about a cracked trough, and a clerk had handed me a light, unsteady, pale amberite hatchling and a form that said natural attrition. I thought about picking up a Dre bandage roll on my own judgment, and deciding that the technique wasn't complicated if you read the anatomy right. I thought about the word enough. I went to the feed room to put away the cleaning materials. The shelf was there, the way it was always there, with 17 objects on it in a row. I stood and looked at them for a moment. A pebble, a piece of shed scale, a folded handful of dried grass. I left them where they were. Dara came by the following morning for her regular weekly visit, which she now made openly and in her actual log, though the entries were brief. She stood at the empty pen for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "Tomas told me." "The whole station knows by now," I said. "Does it bother you?" I thought about it. "No," I said. "He went where he's supposed to be." She was quiet. Then, "The case review from Cress Ridge came through this morning. The non-viable classification has been formally rescinded. The intake record has been updated." She paused. "And I got a letter from a sovereignty veterinary office I've never heard of, thanking me for my consultation and asking if I would be interested in a research position." I looked at her. "I haven't decided," she said. "It's a good offer," I said. "I know it is." She was quiet for a moment. "Did she tell you what he is, what he'll be?" "Enough of it," I said. And he was in my pen," I said. "He was an animal in my pen with a bad wing and no paperwork. That's what I knew. That's what I worked with." Dara looked at the clean, empty pen for another moment. Then she looked at me. "You know," she said, "most people in your position, if they had known." "I know," I said. "They would have done more, made different choices, contacted someone sooner, made sure they got credit for." "I know," I said again. "You didn't know?" "No." She nodded slowly. "And if you had known?" I thought about it. I thought about a March evening and a cracked trough and a pair of pale amber eyes looking at me from a corner of my pen. I thought about what I would have done differently if I had known, on that first evening, what the older woman had told me in this pen the previous afternoon. "I'd have got him a better feed pan," I said. "The one I had was already dented." Dara laughed. It was not a long laugh, but it was a genuine one, the kind that arrives without being planned, and it made the empty pen feel less like absence and more like a space that had been well used. She went on her rounds. I went on mine. The letter came in January. I want to be clear that I did not spend the interim weeks waiting for it. I did my rounds. I took in 2 new quarantine animals, a small Dre with an eye infection, and an unregistered midsize that turned out to be someone's lost domestic from the Verath outpost, which required 3 weeks of correspondence to resolve. I fixed the trough in Pen 9, which had been waiting since March, and which I will admit I had let slide partly from stubbornness about the precedent of letting structural repairs drag. I had several normal conversations with Tomas and several less normal ones, because after the clean vehicle left the station, Tomas had undergone a period of wanting to discuss what had happened, and I had undergone a period of not particularly wanting to. And we had arrived at a compromise in which he asked about it once a week, and I gave him a short answer, and we moved on. The station had been visited during November and December by 2 more individuals from the sovereignty, both of them quiet and thorough, and not forthcoming about their specific purpose. I assumed they were doing whatever official process accompanied a formal registry correction of this scale. I did not ask questions I was not going to get full answers to. I did my rounds. Pen 12 had a new intake in December, an unregistered juvenile that had wandered in from the eastern range and needed 3 weeks of feed and observation before it was healthy enough to be returned to whatever situation it had wandered out of. I ran my morning rounds and my evening rounds and gave it water and mash and checked its condition each day. And it looked at me with its animal eyes, and I looked back with my 31 years of watching animals. And between us we managed. The letter arrived on a January morning in an envelope that was heavier than standard, the kind of paper that announced its own significance before you opened it. My name was on the front, written by hand, in a script I had never seen before. Not difficult to read, very clear, in fact, but dense with a quality I had no reference for, like each character had been considered carefully before it was committed to the page. I opened it in the feed room, because it was where I happened to be. It was short, one page in that same clear hand. It said, "We understand you called him Rennie. We have no objection to this. We wanted you to know that the name has been entered in his registry record as a recognized designation. It will be there as long as the record stands." It said, "We were told what you used to wrap his wing. We were told what you said to the review officer about reading the anatomy and having time in the evenings. We have thought about this description many times since November." It said, "He is well. The joint has stabilized fully as of the last assessment. He asks, in the way of his kind, about the person who kept his water clean and his pan filled and his bedding fresh for 7 months while he called for us. We have told him that person is still at work at pen row 12, which he seems to consider appropriate." It said, "At a time of your choosing, we would be grateful for the chance to thank you properly. There is no obligation and no expected form. It is only that we are his founding line, and you are the reason he exists within it, and we would like to meet the person who kept our lost one warm while he was waiting to be found." It said, "His registry record now carries, beneath his formal designation and above the founding bloodline notation, the following entry: tended in the early period by Cale Bryn, Hareth Station, row 12. This is not a standard registry field. It was created for this record alone." The letter was signed with 2 names in that dense, careful script, and even I, who paid no attention to politics and did not know bloodline names, could feel the weight of the signatures without knowing specifically what they belonged to. I stood in the feed room for a while, holding the letter. I thought about a Tuesday evening in March, and a form that said natural attrition, and a pair of pale amber eyes that had not read the form. I thought about 43 days of ordinary rounds before either of us had done anything as reckless as hum and answer back. I thought about a dray bandage roll and time in the evenings, and the particular quality of a frontier sky through a gap in an old roof panel, and the sound of something calling into it with careful, measured, absolutely certain pulses, while I stood 20 feet away worrying about a cracked trough. I thought he knew exactly what he was doing the whole time. He was not lost. He was waiting in the warmest place available, while the people looking for him figured out where to look. And I was the warmest place available, because I was there, because it was my pen, because when Tomas handed me a form that said natural attrition and an animal that had not read the form, I pointed at pen 12 and asked for clean bedding and a full water bowl. I folded the letter. I put it in my coat pocket. I went to do my morning rounds. Pen 12 had its new intake, the eye infection case, improving well now, scheduled for discharge in a week. I checked its water. I noted the feed levels. I made the entry in the intake log the way I had made it every morning for 31 years, the handwriting the same, the format the same. The January light came through the gaps in the barn roof the way January light comes through every year, thin and specific, catching the dust that moves through old buildings no matter how well you sweep them. At the end of my rounds I stopped, as I sometimes did, at the feed room door. The shelf was still there. The 17 objects were still in their row. I left them where they were. I am not a man who pays attention to politics. I am not a man who knows the names of dragon bloodlines. I am a man who does his rounds in the morning and his rounds in the evening, and attends to the animals that are placed in his care, and I will keep on being that man for as long as they'll have me, And I think that is, in its entirety, the most I have ever had to offer anything. As it turns out, it was sufficient.